Why do countries make serious economic mistakes? History is littered with examples of leaders and governments pursuing policies which in hindsight turned out to be foolish and in some cases catastrophic. But it's rare for the folly to be quite so obvious at the time. I'm talking, of course, about Donald Trump's trade war. The barrage of tariffs that the US president unveiled back on April the 2nd, the day he called Liberation Day, was so confused and haphazard that I believe it did lasting damage to the US standing in the world. Time will tell whether the policy is as mistaken and foolish as it looks, but what is striking is how unified the consensus is in condemning it. With the exception of a handful of true believers in Trump's administration, it's hard to find anyone who thinks this is a good idea. Pretty much everyone else, from trade experts to economists to financiers to business leaders to policy specialists, doubts the trade war will achieve any of Trump's stated goals. Now, you can, of course, say that most of the tariffs have not been implemented and maybe never will be. Perhaps it's all part of a big negotiating ploy, the art of the deal. And that may well end up being the case. But even so, I suspect the mere threat of these policies will prove to be an error. So this week on The Big View, we're going to talk about economic mistakes. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen. To talk about this, I've invited Philip Coggan onto the show. Philip is an author and former journalist at The Economist and the Financial Times, which is where I first got to know him. He's written extensively about finance, markets, and economics, including several excellent books. And he's just published what I can only describe as a polemic about the trade war. It's called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Trump: What the Trade War Means for the World. Philip Coggan, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter.
So let's start with the title of your book. So it's an explicit reference to two famous polemics written by John Maynard Keynes, famous economist, one in 1919, I think, and the other in 1925. Tell us a bit about those titles and why you decided to sort of reach for that reference.
Well, one of my previous books was about economic history, and so I'd read The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, which is the 1925 version of those two books. And it was exactly 100 years, within weeks, that Trump announced the April the 2nd package to Britain returning to the gold standard under Winston Churchill in 1925. And Keynes was asked about it at the time, advised against it, but was ignored. And he came up with this instant book, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, which came out within the year. So I proposed to my publishers, why don't we try to produce something as quickly to argue that this is a similarly big policy mistake. And it meant writing a book extremely quickly. I've never known publishers act as quickly as they have with this. I finished it by the end of May, and it came out in July. So this is extraordinary. Obviously, it couldn't be up with the latest developments, but in a sense, the constantly changing policies are part of the criticism that it's a chaotic approach to setting economic policy, which is one of the flaws of how Mr. Trump has approached things.
So let's just talk about that moment, because you're referring to April the 2nd, right? When Trump announced
Yes.
the reciprocal tariffs, and we'd had this sort of weeks of kind of like building up to this big moment, and then the eyes of the world were on him, and he's there in the Rose Garden in the White House, and he makes this announcement. And what sort of what went through your head at that moment? What was the sort of the trigger that made you think I need to point out the folly of this?
Well, the extraordinary thing is the kind of amateurish combined with the overwhelming overkill of the approach. So we had this, he was holding up this board, which journalists were struggling to read with all these rates. And it applied to so many different countries, including famously McDonald and Heard Islands, occupied only by penguins. And it was within 12 or 18 hours, I think, that James Surowiecki worked out that the formula was not the sophisticated
He's the New
approach
Yorker.
he wrote, yes,
yeah.
The Wisdom of Crowds, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was very quickly established that it wasn't the sophisticated analysis that we were promised, but simply dividing the goods imports from the country by the trade deficit with that country. And then they subsequently tried to dress it up with some Greek numbers, but they all cancelled out. So it was still the same formula. And, the thing that seemed so extraordinary about it was that you were putting sort of 46% tariffs on Vietnam, 37% on Lesotho and places like that, countries which were always going to run a trade surplus with the States. There's nothing to do with cheating or anything. And the strange switch we'd had from, an attack on China as a potentially dangerous global opponent to the US and a country that doesn't always play fairly with trade. So he could have said, right, let's all unite against China. But no, he chose to attack absolutely everybody, allies, poor countries. And it just seemed such a mismanaged and ill thought through approach. And I instantly wrote a Substack piece about it with that title, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Trump. And then, that led me to think, well, this really ought to be a book because there's so much you can say about it.
And there is obviously there's a lot to say about it. And hopefully we'll say some of it here. But I just want to just unpick that parallel a little bit. And I mean, so the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill, the book you're referencing is the 1925 book. 6 years earlier, he'd written the economic consequences of the peace after the Versailles Treaty, which was this polemic against the idea of that it would be a good idea to force Germany to pay all these reparations to allies after World War One. I guess just thinking specifically about the Churchill one. I mean, it seems like there were quite a lot of people at the time, and I'm sure you studied this more closely than I have, who thought that was a good idea, right? I mean, it was. I mean, Keynes disagreed with it, but there were people on the other side of the argument, and I guess with Trump's tariffs, I mean, it seems like the overwhelming consensus is that it's a really bad idea. I mean, There's really only one person who seems to think this is a really good idea, and that's the president himself. And maybe there are a few people around him who
Peter Navarro, yeah,
some true believers around him, but then also some people around him who probably don't really believe in this stuff, but are going along with it to humor him or for their own agendas. So who do you think needs to be sort of armed with the argument that you're making?
Well, I think it is the general public. I think for most people, the intricacies of international trade are a bit of a mystery. They don't stop to think about them. And, there may be a kind of underlying mercantilist approach in people's minds that imports are bad, exports are good. And you need to spell out that this is not the case. It's like saying, going to work to earn money is good and spending it is bad. But no, we export so we can import, so we can afford the things we want from overseas. And there is one other parallel between it, though you're quite right. The experts were against what Trump did, but for what Churchill did. But I think the parallel is nostalgia. So Churchill was harking back to the era before the First World War when the gold standard was there. Britain kind of controlled the global financial system and, was incredibly powerful exporter, huge trade surplus. Churchill wanted somehow to get back to that. And it was a hopeless task because Britain's underlying position had deteriorated so much. And Trump wants to get back to an era when, 20, 30% of the US workforce, male workforce probably, worked in manufacturing. And that's just not going to happen either because manufacturing has been transformed over the last 50, 60 years. Some jobs were lost to trade, but the overwhelming majority of the job losses have been caused by technological change. And, it's across the Western world. Germany has lost a lot of its manufacturing employment, even though it runs a trade surplus. And perhaps the best parallel there is with agriculture. That 200 years ago, most people worked in agriculture. We fed under 1 billion people in the world. Now in Western countries, 1 to 2% of people working in agriculture, but we're feeding 8 billion people worldwide because agriculture is much more efficient. Manufacturing is much more efficient. We are not going to go back to the same kind of jobs totals as Trump had his nostalgia for.
That's a very interesting point about nostalgia, which we should come back to that. I mean, I wonder if what's going on here is that economic logic, which many of the experts, as you say, kind of agree on, that this is a bad idea economically, is being subsumed by or overwhelmed by other forces, and we've seen that before. I mean, last week on this show, actually, I was talking to Dileep Singh, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, and he was drawing the analogy with the period before World War One, which was sort of the first era of globalization, and there was free trade and free movement of people, and there was a sort of general view that this was a great system, and it would be madness to kind of to threaten it. And then World War One broke out, and it all kind of disappeared. So I just wonder whether are we the experts? Are we sort of thinking about? Are we looking at this the wrong way? I suppose.
Yes, well, there was a famous book before the First World War called The Great Illusion, which was, and I've forgotten the author's name now, which argued the countries wouldn't go to war because it was too economically damaging, but they did anyway. Norman Angell, that's who it was by. And yes, I think if you look at the polls of American voters, they aren't incredibly supportive of what Trump is doing. They did worry that these tariffs would cause price rises. And I think the great problem with the Trump strategy is it's so chaotic. We have had so many policy changes. So let's say he'd imposed, I don't know, 20% global tariff and said, that's what it's going to be for the rest of my term. If you really want to avoid it, you should come and build your manufacturing plants in America. Then businesses could plan. But we had the first set of tariffs, then they were suspended. Then we've had another proposed set of tariffs, which might come in on August the 1st, and some of those have already been altered. And there's, of course, he changed his mind so often that you couldn't possibly plan on this basis. And also, he's not imposing a lot of these tariffs because of economic reasons. So the first set on Canada and Mexico were to do with illegal immigration and fentanyl. The 50% on Brazil is to do with trying Bolsonaro. And so, again, if you're a business, you'd have to run through the next 3.5 years thinking somebody in some country is going to say something rude or do something he doesn't like, and I might suddenly find I'm having to pay a 30% tariff or something. And that it's just a chilling of business investment and animal spirits, another thing that Keynes wrote about. And I don't think the public is particularly supportive of this. So,
I mean, I guess the big difference probably between the UK, Great Britain returning to the gold standard in 1925 and the Trump tariff announcement from April the 2nd is that a lot of those tariffs haven't happened yet, right? I mean, he talks about the 46% on Vietnam stuff. I mean, actually, he announced them on the 2nd. He paused them all on the 9th, and then we've had this, as you say, we've been in this sort of whirlwind of negotiations, or and back and forth on, and we've had sort of the outlines of a deal with the UK. We've had an even flimsier outline of a deal with Vietnam. We've had a sort of ceasefire with China. We're recording this actually just overnight. They announced the barest outlines of a deal with Japan, but there's still not a lot of these things have actually been implemented. And a lot of people seem to think actually they won't be implemented, certainly not by August the 1st, and maybe not at all. So is there a sense here that there's a lot of it's the Trump presidency, it's a lot of noise, but actually underlying it all, maybe the policy is not that disastrous because a lot of it just hasn't actually been implemented?
That's the hope, certainly. And I was coming up with a new acronym yesterday. One of the great problems with the trade negotiations is, of course, other countries don't have big tariffs. They don't have that many restrictions on US trade. So countries are trying to work out how to give in to him, to give him the little win he clearly wants, so they can say, right, I've won. So in the Japan deal, there's a supposed $550 billion wealth fund that Japan is going to invest, and there are two things to be said about that. But the first point I'd like to make is that everybody's searching for what I call a unicorn. So a unicorn is an unimportant concession to resolve negotiations. You just need to come up with something, oh, yes, Japan, he accused of having a bowling ball test on cars. They supposedly dropped a bowling ball. If it dented the hood, they didn't import it. They never have had this test, but he keeps going on about it. And so they say, oh, we will drop the bowling ball test and then we'll have won. So that's what we're searching for, and if he accepts all these little deals, then at least the damage will be short-lived. But as I mentioned in my last answer, the worry is that he won't be satisfied for long. He'll find something else to get annoyed about and impose tariffs. But the Japanese point, Paul Krugman made this point in his Substack today. There's two elements to the balance of payments. There's a current account where the goods and services flow, and there's a capital account where capital flows the other way. So they must balance. So if Japan is investing $550 billion into the US, that is a huge capital account surplus, which must be balanced by an offsetting current account deficit. So if you've got a flood of foreign investment coming in, your current account deficit worse, not better. And similarly, if you're trying to eliminate your current account deficit, you don't particularly want to have an incredibly bout of fiscal expansion where your budget deficit gets a lot bigger, because your budget deficit is a key component of your trade deficit. So it just makes no economic sense to say, right, we're trying to get the trade deficit down. We're going to ramp up, cut taxes massively, and get foreign investment in. It doesn't add up.
No, I agree, and there are lots of those types of contradictions. I mean, another one that's again specific to the Japanese deal, as we understand it, is that they've lowered the tariff on imported cars that are exported from Japan to the US to 15%, whereas the tariff that Trump imposed earlier on imported cars is 25%. So you potentially have a situation where a Toyota made in Japan and exported to the US, you pay a 15% tariff, but a car made by General Motors in Mexico and exported to the US would face a 25% tariff. So, the contradictions are quite severe.
And you have big tariffs on the raw materials US companies use to make cars, like steel and aluminium.
Yeah,
right?
Copper. Yeah,
Copper is an important component of electric cars. That's just got a 50% tariff. So, and that's another fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He talks about US cars, Japanese cars, but US cars are 50% made with components bought from overseas. So when you put tariff on those components, you increase the cost of US cars. 45% of all that the US imports are raw materials and components into things the US makes. So you are really increasing your own costs by imposing these tariffs.
So I've spent quite a bit of time in the past 6 months sort of trying to understand the logic behind some of these policies, which has been quite hard. But specifically behind the sort of specific policies. But there is a kind of a diagnosis that emerges, which is sort of something like this, which says basically the US has been underwriting this free trade system for the rest of the world. The rest of the world has been free riding on it. This has hollowed out US manufacturing, as other countries have taken advantage of US sort of free trade on this. The US is now dangerously dependent on other countries for raw materials and products, from steel to semiconductors, which are important for its own self-defense. This system has led to increased expansion of the government and increase in national debt. And, some people have become wealthier, but only because asset markets have risen, and it's pumped up by financial engineering, and ordinary working people have been left behind. And then I guess the sort of the diagnosis sort of ends by sort of saying something like the only way to kind of change this system is through a series of kind of big economic shocks. I mean, what do you make of that sort of analysis?
Well, I challenge it at almost every point. For example, so when you say the US has been underwriting the free trade, yes, for 70 odd years, the US, through GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and then the World Trade Organization, has overseen a system in which barriers to trade have gone down. And in that process, the US has moved from making low margin products like textiles and shoes and things to specializing in high margin products. And it is, its workforce is incredibly productive. I think something like 7 times more productive than the average Chinese worker, the US worker. And that is exactly what Adam Smith suggested sort of 250 years ago should happen. You specialize in the high margin stuff. And the second point then is that, as I mentioned before, manufacturing jobs have gone down, certainly, but that's because of technology much more than it is because of trade. And that's a good thing too, because you're making things more efficiently. And then is the current account deficit the result of other countries cheating? Well, we can see 1991 is the last year that the US ran a current account surplus. Tariffs are an awful lot higher. It's not tariffs that are driving other countries' tariffs that are driving the current account position. It's the essential nature of the US economy, which is that they invest much more than they're willing to save. And you then have to attract investment from abroad. That's the capital account surplus point. And foreigners are more than happy to fund the US's current account deficit. They're more than happy to buy US equities, which are something like 70% of global market capitalization. They're more than happy to buy US bonds, which are the most liquid market in the world. They're more than happy to own the dollar, which is the dominant currency for international transactions. So it's not really a problem that you need to solve. And yes, there have been some problems with real wages in the US, but the big period of stagnation for US real wages was between the mid-70s and the mid-90s. That is before China joined the World Trade Organization and before the free trade agreement with Mexico and China was signed. And the US is a much less equal society than most other OECD countries, all of which are also exposed to globalization. It's not globalization it's not China that makes the US have weaker rights for workers, weaker unemployment benefits, no federal maternity leave, no federal sick leave, no federal holiday pay. That's nothing to do with China or the EU. That's domestic policy considerations. So we're looking at the wrong thing, and Dominic Cummings famously went on about the dead cat that you throw onto the table.
Dominic Cummings was the advisor to
Boris Johnson. Yeah, briefly. Look at this dead cat, which is I've just thrown on the table. Not all the other things that you should be looking at to do with perhaps increasing the federal minimum wage, for example. And that is really what the many billionaires who support Trump or don't want people to focus on. They're quite happy for him to go off and fiddle with trade.
Yeah, no, there is definitely a sense that it's turning a domestic policy failure into an international sort of problem.
Yes,
and blaming on other people. One thing I'm which is a sort of constant conundrum, but you've spent a long time observing and reporting on and writing about financial markets. We're sitting here at the moment. The S&P 500 index is at a new all-time high. Yields on 10-year US government bonds, they went up a bit in the sort of immediate post April the 2nd sort of turmoil, but they're back down. Markets are generally pretty relaxed about all of this. I mean, the dollar is down a bit, gold is up a bit, but it's hardly sort of meltdown. So how do you reconcile that, given what you've been talking about, and if you're right about the sort of the consequences of this policy, why is that not filtered through more obviously into financial markets?
Well, it's because on April the 9th, he dropped a lot of those initial high tariffs after bond yields had shot up and the markets had fallen. And people thought he'd learned the lesson that you can't actually impose these because they'll cause financial chaos. So an FT writer, Robert Armstrong, came up with the idea of the TACO trade, Trump always chickens out. And I think that's clearly what markets are thinking, that he makes these threats, he doesn't really follow through on them. The tariffs were supposed to get reimposed on July the 9th, and they actually got postponed again to August the 1st. So they think that will just infinitely get postponed. Like, men his age who promise to go on a diet, and it's always, next week and not today. I'll just have that extra burger. But I think there's a couple of fundamental paradoxes with the taco trade. One is that because the markets are not reacting, when he announces these new tariffs, he's starting to say, oh, well, the markets aren't bothered about this. They're quite happy with my tariffs.
Yeah.
So that will encourage him to push on through. And the second is it does require other countries to believe he's not bluffing for them to make the kind of concessions he might want, except if we can get one of these unicorns, a kind of unimportant concession. So my worry is that in the absence of a market reaction, he may actually go through with more of these tariffs, and it may take a much bigger sell-off, in the autumn perhaps, for him actually to give up altogether. And this, again, comes with the problem of having no really coherent strategy. What are you doing? You're trying to isolate China? Are you trying to bring back manufacturing jobs? Are you trying to eliminate the trade deficit? And it's not clear which of these three things he's trying to do, and he's probably failing at all of them.
Yeah. And raise tariff revenue. That's the other one, obviously.
And raise tariff revenue. But again, a contradiction there. If you raise a lot of tariff revenues, you must be having a lot of imports, so therefore you're not bringing jobs back home.
Yeah, no, they're mutually exclusive. A lot of those things. I mean, the subtitle of your book is "What the Trade War Means for the World," and I guess I'm curious to what extent you think. So here we are, sort of, several months on from April the 2nd. What extent do you think the Trump trade virus is contained to the US, or will it spread to other countries? I mean, that seems to be at least up for debate whether or not the world trading system minus the US sort of holds together. And there are some signs that maybe actually some other countries will be more enthusiastic about building trade links now that they can't rely on the US. How do you see it?
Yes, I think the great irony about this is it's a great loss of US soft power. The 70, 80 years of the US building up the world trading system, being the center of the world, has been fatally undermined by this, because he's attacked allies, not just on trade, of course, but things like, threatening to annex Greenland and so on. And so China, which previously in some parts of the world was seen as a bit of a threatening power, is now seems a much more reliable trading partner. They don't ask any questions about your politics. They don't suddenly slap you with tariffs. You can probably guess that Chinese trade policy in next year will be the same as Chinese policy this year, whereas you can't be sure of that next week in the US. But I think there is a worry for the FT did a good piece a couple of weeks ago, in early July. FT did a good piece in early July about Lesotho and how it, basically it exports two things: diamonds and apparel. And suddenly, they were hit with these tariffs, and they built up this textile industry, which it's enormously successful. Very poor country, not an easy shift for them to make to get out of it if they're going to be landed with these very high tariffs. And so we could yet, if these tariffs remain at the kind of levels that he was suggesting in the mid-July series, or post-August the 1st, you could get kind of like a dumping war in the rest of the world with Asian, African countries trying to offload their products in Europe and with each other because they can't get into the US. And so that's when the kind of threat to the stability of the world trading system may show up.
Yeah, that's then you get a sort of 1930s style sort of trade war and slump. Although there were some people, I think, who were a bit more. We had Richard Baldwin from IMD Business School was on the show a few weeks ago,
yes.
and seemed quite optimistic that actually that sort of infrastructure of the world of the WTO and the world trading system is so baked into a lot of legislation and sort of practices that it's going to be quite hard for countries to just sort of turn their backs on it.
But of course, remember that in his first term, he undermined the WTO because he refused to nominate candidates to the appellate court of it.
Yeah.
So that now doesn't have a quorum. So you can't rule, the WTO can't rule on disputes because they don't have enough people.
Yeah.
And so it's slightly lost all its teeth for settling disputes.
Yeah. Perhaps just to finish up, I mean, just to go back to Keynes and Churchill in 1925. I mean, it took 6 years really for Keynes to be proved right. Well, he was proved right a bit earlier than that, probably, but it was 1931 that Great Britain then finally definitively came off the gold standard and sort of admitted that policy had been a mistake. Channeling the ghost of Keynes, how long do you think it will take for Trump to sort of be definitively proved wrong, or for this policy to be properly discredited and consigned to history?
I think it won't be consigned to history until he leaves office in 2029, or unless he is not well enough to continue later on, because he's believed in this policy for 40 years. He was writing editorials in the New York Times, I think, or adverts in the New York Times a long time ago. So he is a mercantilist. He does not believe that imports are good. He believes a trade deficit somehow means people cheating. So I worry because the reason that Britain went back off the gold standard in 1931 was because we'd had absolute calamity in the global economy, and suddenly it was impossible to sustain it. And the countries that went off the gold standard first recovered quickest from the Great Depression. So France, which kept going until 1936, had a much slower recovery. So even if Trump loses control of Congress in the midterms, all of this is being imposed by executive order. The courts aren't standing up to him. The kind of wise heads that we had in the first Trump term, who would kind of quietly forget about what he suggested and leave it at the end of the bottom of the pile on the desk until he forgot about it, they aren't in existence anymore. It's all acolytes. So I don't think we'll be safe from tariffs until 2029, and that's even assuming that the Democrats win that presidential election.
Yeah, so
the 2028 presidential election.
Trump leaves office, yes, so all those kinds of things.
Yes, or that he leaves. Or there even is a presidential election, indeed. Yes.
Okay, well, that's for perhaps for a different conversation, and maybe a different book. But Philip, thank you. This has been really illuminating. So thanks very much for taking the time to chat.
Thanks, Peter.
That's all we have time for this week. Thanks to Philip for that conversation, and as always, thanks to you for listening. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favourite platform. Don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Viewsroom, a lively conversation between Breaking News columnists, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team, Reuters World News and Reuters Econ World. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and leave a comment to let us know what you thought. And don't forget to check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.